Let's be clear, letting go isn't weakness, it's strategy. Investors don't hold on to bad assets out of emotion. They cut losses, protect capital, and reposition for growth. Your time is capital. Your focus is currency. Your emotional energy is your most valuable asset. If you keep investing in people and situations that show no long-term return, you're not loyal, you're undisciplined. Today, we're not talking about soft advice. We're talking about 5 core life principles that separate emotional amateurs from disciplined visionaries. This is about ambition. This is about focus. This is about building a life that compounds. Most people don't struggle because they lack intelligence. They struggle because they delay accepting what is obvious. Reality speaks early and quietly. Emotions argue loudly and late. And when those two collide, most people choose the louder voice. You've seen it in your own life. Someone shows you who they are through consistent behavior, unreliability, disrespect, indifference. The data is there. The pattern is clear. But instead of accepting the evidence, you negotiate with it. You tell yourself you need more time. You reinterpret the signs. You highlight the exceptions and ignore the rule. That delay feels compassionate in the moment. In truth, it is expensive. Acceptance is not emotional, it is analytical. It is the ability to look at repeated outcomes and draw a clean conclusion without dressing it up to protect your feelings. When you refuse to do that, you begin paying opportunity costs. Every day you spend trying to change what has already revealed itself is a day you are not investing in something more aligned with your future. Think about a simple business decision. If a product consistently loses money, a disciplined operator studies the numbers and adjusts quickly. They don't keep pouring capital into it because they once believed in it. They don't defend it because of how much effort they've already invested. They cut losses and redirect resources. That is not cold-hearted. That is rational stewardship of limited capital. Your time and emotional energy are capital. When you hold on to a failing relationship, a draining friendship, or a stagnant environment, you are allocating scarce resources to an asset that shows declining returns. The longer you delay acceptance, the more resources you burn. And the most dangerous part is that this burn is gradual. It doesn't feel catastrophic. It feels manageable. That's why people stay stuck for years. Emotions operate on hope. Hope is powerful when paired with evidence. It is destructive when it ignores evidence. When someone repeatedly disappoints you, the logical response is to adjust expectations or involvement. Instead, many people double down. They think increased effort will produce a different outcome. They confuse persistence with wisdom. But persistence without data is just stubbornness dressed as loyalty. There is a subtle psychological trap called sunk cost. The more you invest in something, the harder it becomes to walk away. You think, I've already given so much. And that thought becomes the justification to give even more. But past investment does not guarantee future return. In fact, it often blinds you to reality. You start defending your previous decision rather than evaluating your current position. That is how years disappear. Acceptance requires humility. It requires you to admit that your initial judgment might have been wrong, or that circumstances have changed. It asks you to separate your identity from the situation. That separation is uncomfortable. If you admit the relationship isn't healthy, you must also admit you stayed longer than you should have. If you admit the opportunity isn't right, you must admit you miscalculated. The ego resists this. It would rather protect pride than protect potential. But pride is expensive. Discipline is profitable. When you accept reality early, you free mental bandwidth. The human brain has limited focus. When part of it is constantly analyzing, justifying, worrying, or replaying the same scenario, your cognitive resources are fragmented. Fragmented focus leads to diluted effort. Diluted effort produces mediocre results, and then you wonder why progress feels slow. Imagine someone trying to build a career while constantly dealing with emotional turbulence from a chaotic relationship. They wake up thinking about unresolved arguments. They check their phone repeatedly. They replay conversations in their head during work hours. On paper, they are working 8 hours. In reality, their attention is divided. Over time, this divided focus shows up in performance reviews, missed opportunities, and stalled growth. The root cause isn't lack of talent, it's unaccepted reality. Acceptance simplifies life. It draws clean lines. This works. This doesn't. This aligns with my future. This distracts from it. When you think this way, decisions become clearer, and clarity is a competitive advantage. Most people live in emotional fog. They hesitate. They second guess. They oscillate between hope and frustration. Meanwhile, disciplined thinkers move forward because they are not debating facts. This does not mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you become accurate. Emotional maturity is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to let feeling coexist with truth without distorting it. You can care about someone and still acknowledge they are not aligned with your long-term direction. You can feel disappointed and still accept that the situation will not change without consistent evidence of change. Notice the emphasis on evidence. Words are cheap. Intentions are invisible. Patterns are measurable. When you train yourself to observe patterns instead of promises, you reduce emotional volatility. You stop being surprised by predictable outcomes. And when you are not surprised, you are not destabilized. Cause and effect is always operating, whether you acknowledge it or not. If you continue investing time in something that repeatedly drains you, the outcome will be exhaustion. If you repeatedly excuse behavior that contradicts your values, the outcome will be resentment. If you delay difficult conversations because they feel uncomfortable, the outcome will be prolonged confusion. Every avoidance today becomes complexity tomorrow. Long-term thinking requires short-term discomfort. The discomfort of acceptance is sharp but brief. The discomfort of denial is dull but prolonged. One forces you to confront reality once. The other forces you to wrestle with it daily. When you choose acceptance, you compress the pain. When you choose denial, you stretch it. There is also a quiet confidence that comes from facing facts early. You begin trusting yourself more. You know that when something feels off and the data supports that feeling, you will act. That self-trust compounds. It sharpens your judgment. It strengthens your boundaries and improves your decision-making across all areas of life. People who delay acceptance often say they are waiting for clarity. In truth, clarity is already present. What they are waiting for is comfort. They want the decision to feel easy. It rarely does. Growth decisions often feel like loss in the moment. You let go of an illusion. You release a version of the future you imagine. That grieving process is real, but grieving reality is healthier than clinging to fantasy. When you accept reality faster than your emotions do, you shorten recovery time. You redirect focus sooner. You stop leaking energy into arguments that have already been decided by evidence. And slowly, your life becomes more intentional. You choose based on alignment, not attachment. You invest based on patterns, not potential alone. You protect your time as if it matters, because it does. The discipline of early acceptance does not make you harsh. It makes you efficient. It keeps your priorities clean. It prevents divided focus from quietly eroding your ambition. And over years, not weeks, that discipline separates those who drift from those who build with precision. Loyalty sounds noble until you examine where it is directed. Most people pride themselves on being loyal, but very few examine the cost of that loyalty. Loyalty without boundaries is not strength. It is unmanaged attachment. It feels honorable in the moment, but over time it becomes self-betrayal. The uncomfortable truth is that if your loyalty consistently requires you to shrink, tolerate disrespect, or compromise your long-term direction, you are not protecting a relationship, you are sacrificing yourself. Human beings fear rejection more than they fear misalignment, so they stay. They excuse behavior. They rationalize inconsistency. They tell themselves that everyone has flaws, which is true, but they ignore patterns that directly conflict with their values. The trade-off happens quietly. You trade clarity for connection. You trade standards for temporary harmony. You trade long-term self-respect for short-term approval. Consider a simple scenario. You have goals that require discipline, waking early, studying, building a side business, improving your health, but the people closest to you operate differently. They mock structure. They encourage distraction. They treat ambition as arrogance. At first you laugh along. You don't want to appear rigid. You value the relationship. So you compromise your schedule occasionally. Then occasionally becomes regularly. Then regularly becomes your new baseline. Months later, you wonder why your progress stalled. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no single catastrophic decision. Just small repeated choices to prioritize belonging over growth. Loyalty without boundaries slowly redirected your energy away from your own development. The outcome is predictable, divided focus, diluted effort, and average results. Boundaries are often misunderstood as emotional walls. In reality, they are filters. A filter does not hate what it excludes. It simply protects what is inside. If you are building a future that requires concentration and resilience, you cannot allow unlimited access to your time and attention. When someone consistently disrespects your schedule, dismisses your ambitions, or drains your energy with avoidable chaos, and you continue to make space for it, you are signaling that your priorities are negotiable. Every yes to misalignment is a no to something more aligned. This is opportunity cost in its purest form. You only have so many focused hours in a day. If those hours are spent repairing avoidable conflict, explaining your goals to people who don't value them, or recovering from emotional turbulence, they are not being invested in skill development, strategic thinking, or long-term planning. Over time, the compounding effect of misplaced loyalty becomes visible in stagnant income, inconsistent habits, and unrealized potential. Many people confuse endurance with character. They think staying in a draining dynamic proves depth. But character is not measured by how much dysfunction you can tolerate. It is measured by how clearly you can define your standards and how consistently you uphold them. If someone repeatedly crosses a boundary and you repeatedly adjust that boundary to keep them comfortable, you are training them to disregard you. Human behavior adapts to what is tolerated. There is also a subtle psychological cost. When you ignore your own limits to preserve a connection, you begin to fragment internally. Part of you knows something is wrong. Another part tries to justify it. This internal conflict consumes energy. You become irritable, less focused, less decisive. Not because you are weak, but because you are operating against your own values. Alignment creates calm. Misalignment creates friction. Think about the professional who stays loyal to a workplace that underpays and undervalues them out of gratitude for a past opportunity. At first, it seems reasonable, but year after year, the gap between their contribution and their compensation widens. They watch peers move forward. They feel resentment but silence it because they don't want to seem ungrateful. Eventually, their motivation declines, their performance suffers. The very loyalty they believed was virtuous becomes the reason they stagnate. Cause and effect rarely announce themselves loudly. Choices compound quietly. If you choose to stay in an environment that does not respect your growth, the trade-off is slower development. Slower development leads to fewer opportunities. Fewer opportunities reinforce self-doubt, and self-doubt makes it even harder to leave. What began as loyalty becomes a cycle of limitation. Boundaries require courage because they risk tension. When you assert standards, some people will resist. They benefited from your flexibility. They were comfortable with your availability. Your growth disrupts that comfort. But discomfort is not evidence that you are wrong. It is often evidence that you are shifting from reactive living to intentional living. There is a difference between supporting someone and carrying them. Support is mutual and sustainable. Carrying is one-sided and exhausting. If a relationship consistently demands that you compensate for another person's lack of discipline, lack of accountability, or lack of direction, you must examine the long-term cost. You cannot build stability while constantly absorbing instability. This does not mean you abandon people at the first sign of difficulty. Discipline is not impulsiveness. It means you evaluate patterns over time. Are apologies followed by changed behavior? Is respect consistent or conditional? Does this connection strengthen your focus or scatter it? Honest answers to these questions require self-respect. Self-respect is not loud. It is quiet consistency. It shows up in how you allocate your evenings, how you respond to repeated disrespect, how you protect your mornings, how you guard your energy. It understands that ambition requires structure, and structure cannot coexist with chronic chaos. Some people fear that setting boundaries will leave them alone. In some seasons, it might. But temporary solitude is often less damaging than prolonged misalignment. When you reduce noise, you hear yourself think. When you remove constant distraction, you regain depth. And depth is necessary for meaningful progress. If your vision for your life includes financial independence, strong health, emotional stability, and long-term impact, you must evaluate whether your current loyalties support that direction. Loyalty should amplify your strengths, not erode them. It should challenge you to grow, not pressure you to shrink. When you stop negotiating your standards to maintain connection, something shifts internally. You begin making decisions from a place of clarity rather than fear. You stop over-explaining your goals. You stop apologizing for discipline. You accept that not everyone will understand your direction, and that understanding is not a requirement for action. Misplaced loyalty divides priorities. Divided priorities weaken outcomes. Weakened outcomes create regret. The pattern is simple, even if the emotions around it are complex. If you want focused results, your environment must respect focus. If you want long-term growth, your relationships must allow space for growth. The people who thrive over decades are not necessarily more talented. They are more selective. They choose where to invest attention. They choose who has access to their inner circle. They choose standards over sentiment when the two conflict. This selectiveness is not arrogance. It is stewardship of limited time. In the end, loyalty is powerful when aligned with values and vision. But when it demands self-neglect, it becomes a liability. You do not owe anyone access to your future at the cost of your potential. Protecting your direction is not selfish. It is disciplined. And discipline, sustained over time, is what quietly separates those who drift from those who deliberately build. One of the hardest realities to accept is that you are often not attached to who someone is. You are attached to who they used to be, or who you hoped they would become. Memory is selective. It edits out the ordinary and highlights the peak moments. You replay the early conversations, the shared laughter, the promises, the version of them that felt aligned with your values. But memory is not a current report. It is an archive. And making present-day decisions based on outdated information is how people stay stuck. Human beings form attachments through emotional intensity. The beginning of a relationship, friendship, or partnership often carries excitement, novelty, and optimism. During that phase, effort is high. Attention is consistent. Words are generous. You build an internal image of who that person is. The problem begins when the behavior shifts, but your internal image does not. Instead of updating your evaluation based on new data, you protect the original version in your mind. This is where denial quietly enters. You tell yourself they are just stressed. You blame external circumstances. You reference how they used to be. You give weight to potential instead of patterns. The trade-off seems small at first. You sacrifice a little clarity to preserve connection, but over time, that trade-off compounds. Patterns are the most honest form of communication. Anyone can have a good month. Anyone can say the right words, but consistency reveals character. If someone repeatedly cancels commitments, dismisses your concerns, or fails to follow through, that pattern carries more predictive value than any early promise. When you ignore patterns because you are emotionally attached to a past version of them, you separate yourself from reality. Cause and effect operates quietly here. You hold on to the past image. Because of that attachment, you tolerate behavior that contradicts your standards. Tolerance without boundaries leads to resentment. Resentment leads to tension. Tension erodes trust. And eventually, the relationship becomes a source of stress rather than strength. The very thing you were trying to preserve becomes damaged because you refuse to see it clearly. There is also an identity element involved. When you connect deeply with someone, your future plans may intertwine. You imagine shared milestones, mutual growth, stability. Letting go of who they used to be feels like letting go of that imagined future. So you defend the fantasy. You negotiate with reality. You tell yourself that if you just communicate better, support more, wait longer, the original version will return. But growth requires alignment in the present, not nostalgia for the past. Discipline demands that you evaluate people based on who they are consistently now. This does not mean people cannot change. It means change must be demonstrated, not assumed. Real change is visible in behavior sustained over time. Anything less is temporary emotion. Consider a common scenario. Someone begins a relationship with strong ambition. They talk about goals, self-improvement, building a better future. Over time, their actions shift. They become complacent. They resist growth. They mock structure. You, however, continue pushing forward. Instead of accepting the divergence, you cling to who they were at the start. You believe that version is still inside them, just hidden. Months turn into years. Meanwhile, your momentum slows because you are constantly negotiating this gap between who they are and who you believe they could be. The cost here is focus. Mental energy spent hoping someone returns to an earlier version is energy not spent refining your own path. Divided attention weakens results. If half your mind is occupied with fixing, motivating, or compensating for someone else, your own growth becomes secondary. The outcome is predictable: slower progress, subtle frustration, and quiet regret. There is also a deeper psychological trap at work. When you invest in someone's potential, you tie your own sense of judgment to their eventual success. If they don't evolve, it feels like you misjudge them. To avoid admitting that, you keep believing. You extend timelines. You reinterpret evidence. This protects your ego in the short term, but damages your future in the long term. Detachment from who someone used to be requires intellectual honesty. It means saying that was real at the time, but it is not real now. It means recognizing that people can change in both directions. Some grow, some stagnate, some regress. Your responsibility is not to drag someone toward growth. Your responsibility is to ensure your environment supports your own trajectory. Think about opportunity cost again. If you stay emotionally attached to a past version of someone, you are closing yourself off from present opportunities. You may miss healthier relationships. You may delay important decisions. You may hesitate to relocate, pursue a demanding project, or take a calculated risk because you are waiting for alignment that no longer exists. Waiting has a cost. It consumes time, and time does not replenish. There is a quiet discipline in updating your beliefs based on new evidence. In investing, markets change, conditions shift. What was once promising may no longer make sense. The disciplined thinker reassesses without emotional attachment to the original thesis. In life, relationships require the same clarity. The initial story you told yourself must be revised if the facts change. Emotionally, this is difficult because memory is comforting. It reminds you of warmth, laughter, connection. But discipline is not about denying good memories. It is about separating them from present decisions. You can appreciate what was without allowing it to dictate what will be. That distinction protects your future. When you detach from fantasy, something stabilizes internally. You stop arguing with what is happening. You stop trying to resurrect a version of someone that no longer shows up consistently. Your expectations adjust, and with adjusted expectations comes reduced disappointment. Clarity replaces confusion. This clarity strengthens standards. You begin to value consistency over intensity. You look for alignment over excitement. You understand that ambition requires stable support systems, not unpredictable cycles. Over time, this mindset influences every area of life. You become less reactive, more observant. You assess patterns early. You act sooner. Misplaced attachment to the past quietly divides your loyalty between memory and reality. Divided loyalty creates hesitation. Hesitation delays action. Delayed action reduces momentum. And momentum, once lost, is hard to rebuild. All of this begins with a simple refusal to update your view. Letting go of who someone used to be is not bitterness. It is accuracy. It is choosing to evaluate based on evidence rather than emotion. It is respecting your own long-term vision enough to refuse dependency on outdated versions of people. When you operate from this level of clarity, your decisions become cleaner, your focus becomes sharper, and your growth is no longer tied to someone else's unrealized potential, but anchored in your own disciplined direction. Most people interpret endings as losses because they focus only on what disappeared. A relationship ends, a job falls apart, a partnership dissolves, and the mind immediately calculates what is missing. The attention goes to the shared routines, the security, the identity attached to that situation, but very few people stop to calculate what has been returned to them. When something leaves your life, whether by your choice or by circumstance, three assets quietly come back under your control: time, energy, and attention. The real question is not what you lost. The real question is how you will reallocate what you just regained. Think about it practically. If you were investing money in one asset consistently underperformed, selling it would not mean you hate it. It would mean you are relocating capital to something with better long-term prospects. In life, emotional attachment clouds this logic. You hold on to draining dynamics because you fear the emptiness that follows. But emptiness is not a void. It is unused capacity. And unused capacity can be directed. When a demanding relationship ends, you suddenly have evenings free. When a chaotic job situation ends, your nervous system slowly stabilizes. When a distracting friendship fades, your mind becomes quieter. These are not small shifts. These are reclaimed resources. The problem is that many people reallocate them poorly. Instead of reinvesting in growth, they reinvest in rumination. Cause and effect is simple here. Something ends. You feel discomfort. To soothe the discomfort, you replay conversations, stalk social media, seek validation from others, or jump into another distraction. The newly available time and energy get consumed by emotional processing without structure. Weeks pass, nothing improves. You conclude the ending damaged you, when in reality the damage came from mismanagement of what followed. Reallocation requires intention. If you free up 3 hours a day because a relationship ended, those 3 hours will go somewhere. They will either be invested deliberately or spent unconsciously. If invested deliberately into health, skill development, deeper work, reading, planning, they compound. If spent unconsciously into scrolling, complaining, chasing closure,